So in part one, we discussed the Supreme Court, where it gets its power from, what it has jurisdiction over, and we discussed treason in the case of Douglas Chandler. Again, that National Geographic article will be posted underneath these videos. So now we're going on to John Jay, which we discussed in the Life in the Box slides. So John Jay, I think it's important I try to hit on him because he's kind of the forgotten founding father in my way of thinking, and you need to know about him. So he led the way in legitimizing the reputation of the new court overseas. He made the rest of the world take it seriously. He crafted the boundaries and the responsibilities of the Supreme Court that are still followed today. And as we learned in Life in the Box, his lineage was different from most of the founders in that his parents were French Huguenot refugees and not British citizens. So after he went to school, Jay became a part of the political world and a really very successful attorney. Jay was hesitant initially to engage in the revolutionary cause. He didn't really think it necessary. He thought that the colony's relationship with England could be saved. He disagreed with his views on, with the prevailing views on separation and making the United States of America as we know it today. So he visited London with a delegation to the king, and he tried to negotiate a peace with King George's government. And King George is this man right here. You might remember him from a previous history class as the Mad King, the king who went insane on the throne. But that's him. So once in the court of King George, he learned that the British weren't going to take us at all seriously until we declared and won a war, which we really won because the British didn't take us seriously as a fighting force. So Jay came back and started to promote revolution in the colonies. And in 1778, when John Jay was 33, he was appointed president of the Continental Congress. And this was a big deal because this was the highest civilian post that we had back then, especially during wartime. So he wasn't exactly the president as you think of him today, but he would send stuff and the army reported to him, and he led meetings of the Congress. I guess you could think of him more as like the American Prime Minister. I don't know if there's a 2023 comparison that everybody would understand, but maybe kind of like a prime minister leading the government. Anyway, because then back at that point there wasn't a government like we have now, and even after the war we had a confederation, and after we wouldn't have this country as we know it now and for a while still. But anyway, I digress. So within the year, Jay was reappointed to a diplomatic position in Spain to ensure their allegiance. So then he traveled to Paris to assist in negotiating a peace treaty with England after the war was over. And I guess he missed the news on the boat back to America. I don't know. But when he came home, he found that he had been appointed Secretary for Foreign Affairs under the Articles of Confederation. Think of Secretary of Foreign Affairs as kind of like the Secretary of State in the U.S. of today. There is a direct equivalency there. So Jay served in this role until the Articles of Confederation started to fail. Jay contributed 5 essays to the Federalist Papers. I hope you know he was one of the authors. Depending on what semester you've had me and what year you're listening to this, you may or may not have read one of the essays. But there it is, the Federalist Papers. which pushed for the Constitution as we know it today to be ratified. So Jay is somewhere in there. Once upon a time, I used to know where exactly he was. Once upon a time. I know this is Franklin. I can tell that. I can tell you that. I believe, don't quote me on it, I believe this is Jefferson. Either this guy or this guy is Washington. And that's about all I know without heavily speculating. So President Washington saw this guy and recognized that he had a lot of talent, and he wanted him to hold a leadership position in the new government. So he decided that Jay should be on the new Supreme Court, and he appointed Jay as Chief Justice in 1789, so the leader of the Supreme Court. And he kind of has a double distinction here because he was the Chief Justice and he was also Justice number 1. So the first justice ever appointed to the Supreme Court, as well as the leader. So Chief Justice Jay did a great job in reinforcing the separation of powers by refusing to give formal counsel to members of the executive branch. He informally offered any guidance necessary. And this, as I say, really did go a long way towards maintaining the separation of powers, even in some nations today, like Australia, for instance. Government officials will ask a member of the High Court, well, how would you rule on this piece of legislation if it came before you? Jay wouldn't do that in the guise of Chief Justice John Jay. But if, President Washington said, hey, John, after hours, how would you like to get a beer and talk about some stuff? Sure, he'd offer any guidance that the president or anybody else might have wanted. But he was very disappointed with what he could do as Chief Justice. Justices of the Supreme Court can't do anything, even today. They can't do a darn thing unless a suit is brought. So unless somebody comes and says, this person did this to me, or an ambassador comes and says, I can't even come up with a hypothetical at the moment, but you can't do anything as a justice or a judge in any level of the federal judiciary or state judiciary unless somebody brings something before you. So he retired as Chief Justice and became the governor of New York, an infinitely more powerful position because he didn't have to wait to act. He could take independent action on his own. So in 1800, Jay left political life to move back to his farm. He had served his country, he had served as president. It was time just for him. And he had a nice long retirement of 29 years where he studied, he engaged with the church until he died in 1829 after a life of service. So sometimes if I'm short some points on a test, I might ask you about, the first Chief Justices. So left to right, top to bottom. Here's John Jay, his successor, John Rutledge, Oliver Ellsworth, John Marshall, who we'll talk about later in this lesson, which might be worth remembering, Roger B. Taney, Salmon. Yes, Salmon was a name for men way back when. B. Chase, Morrison Waite, and Melville W. Fuller. So just to recap, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was John Jay. He served from October 19th, 1789 to June 29th, 1795. So 1789 to 1795. About 6 years on the Supreme Court. He was appointed by President George Washington, commissioned on September 26, 1789, sworn in October 19th, 1789. Can you imagine the government doing anything that quickly these days? And he left, he retired from the Supreme Court to become governor of New York, to do something, I guess. He was succeeded by John Rutledge, and his other distinction is that he was the first justice of the Supreme Court. He was justice number 1. So, this is the old Supreme Court building in the U.S. Capitol. It isn't really the building, I shouldn't say that. It's the old Supreme Court chambers in the U.S. Capitol building. The furniture is really that small. We are a lot bigger than our ancestors, and it was used for 50 years, from 1810 to 1860, on a full-time basis. So that is John Jay, and a little bit more about the Supreme Court. We'll cover Marbury versus Madison, and talk about the Marshall Court in part 3.